he begins to do the very things that his father did, the very things that the two brothers resent their father for having done. The pain
They
that
resent him for it, and they also profess not to understand it.
That's
and I
right.
think that's an important part of this as well.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that they're being hypocritical or dishonest when they say that. There's this dialogue between them, like what leads someone to covet, and he says, oh, well, the younger brother says, well, you like material things. He says, yeah, but I use them. I enjoy my comforts, but I use them. The things themselves don't hold value for me. And I think that's a valid thing to say.
Sure.
But what they come to ultimately, perhaps in a relatively costless way, in this film, because the stakes ultimately it resolves in a way that sort of makes them laugh at themselves,
Yeah.
They come to understand their father's fault better from the inside. And I think that also ties in together with the theme of fatherhood that we've been dealing with for so many of the episodes in this series.
That's right. That's right.
So there is a sort of reconciliation.
That's a good point.
In a sense.
That's a good point. Yeah, because if this is one thread that we've been tracking more or less through all of these episodes, and this was not something at the outset that I was expecting, but it's been there from the beginning. This theme of the sins of the father, basically.
Right.
Well, here we have two adult men admitting that they don't understand their father's sins. And so they get burned precisely by their father's sins.
Right.
This man is dead. He's gone. The stamp collection means nothing to him. But the sins that he committed in his life continue to bear their evil fruit in the lives of his sons. And because they haven't worked to understand the sins of their father, to say nothing of forgiving the sins of their father, they're totally, hapless victims when all of this comes their way, when they inherit all of this as everybody one day will. So I think that there's something to that by the end they understand it, but it's almost as if, you're going to have to go through this one way or the other. You're going to understand the sins of your father, at the outset and forgive them before you have to suffer the consequences, or you're going to understand them from the inside, dealing with them intimately as they wreak havoc in your life. And you pass on the other hand, to the next generation.
Yeah, but also I think that, there is a part of them that is probably trying to connect with their father in some way.
I see.
It's not just that they're interested in the stamps and the money for the value of them for its own sake, because they talk about, well, let's not sell it yet. I think that there is a part of them that wants to connect with him, because they say that he's been absent in their lives. And so there is something where they are, with their faults, and their blindness, they are still going on a necessary journey, and they still are seeking something positive in trying to connect with their father.
If their father had loved them instead of loving his stamp collection, then this would not have been something that they had to go through.
Right.
Right. So that, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that I think that the responsibility of the father and the way his sins are borne out in the lives of his children is something that we see as a kind of echoed and repeated theme through all of these episodes, more or less.
Yeah.
Even in Dekalog 5, where there is no father really in. I think maybe the young lawyer becomes a father recently at the end of the film, but there's mention of the young man who commits the murder. There's mention of his father, I think, if I recall correctly, and the effect that his father and his upbringing had on him. And so, even I only mention that because that was one instance where the father wasn't explicitly present, but still is worked into the film by Kieslowski in the writing or in the backstory. So here is this sort of explicit reconciling with the sins of the father that doesn't always happen in the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a very appropriate ending point, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned responsibility, and that is sort of a theme as well. And it seems to me that, well, let me read something that Kieslowski said. So he said a number of times that he said that he believed, this is in his commentary on Dekalog in the book Kieslowski on Kieslowski.
Yeah.
And he said he did believe in an absolute moral reference point, but more in terms of the God of the Old Testament than of the New. And he proceeds to lay out this very sort of cliched, theologically incorrect view of the differences between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. He says the Old Testament God was demanding and cruel, didn't forgive, and expected absolute adherence to the principles he laid down, whereas the New Testament God was a merciful, kind-hearted old man who forgives everything. And then he goes on to say, the God of the Old Testament leaves us a lot of freedom and responsibility, observes how we use it, and then rewards or punishes, and there's no appeal or forgiveness. Obviously not true. It's something which is lasting, absolute, evident, and is not relative. And that's what a point of reference must be, especially for people like me who are weak, who are looking for something, who don't know. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things you could talk about in that statement, especially when he says, that's actually what I need is this absolute point of reference.
Right.
But what I wanted to single out specifically was this idea of leaving us a lot of freedom and responsibility and observing how we use it and allowing us to suffer the consequences. So it seems to me that if you were going to pick a subject matter for exploring the theme of moral responsibility, fatherhood would maybe be the ideal subject matter to discuss that, because the consequences are not just affecting you, but affecting others in such an immediate way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting just to think of, Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and his preoccupation with this idea of choice and responsibility and freedom. And the fact that we are given this terrible freedom and responsibility by God, and how consequential that is.
Right.
But I was talking to a friend just last night about, he was sort of lamenting the state of the world and why does God allow people to be born into a world that is so messed up that it inculcates them before they have time to make a chance to make their own choices in evil ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I said, well, why were Adam and Eve allowed to make a choice that affected the whole human race? And not just why were they allowed to make the choice, but why did God choose to ordain things such that the whole human race would be affected by their choice?
Sure.
Without having a choice to. In other words, I would be, even if I never committed a willful sin in my life, I would still be a victim of original sin.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have an answer to that question, and what all of what we can draw from the mystery of that, where God actually allows our actions to send others to hell in a way, even though those people are still responsible for their own choices, that we still do affect others in these really decisive ways.
Yeah.
But I think that fatherhood is a great theme for exploring that, because you might say it's you might say it's unjust. Why should children not exist in isolation from the moral choices of their parents?
Yeah.
And God does say in the Old Testament, no longer will it, the sins of the fathers be carried down to the fourth and fifth generation. It'll just be the immediate next generation. And he's talking in terms of sort of God's active punishment, not so much just the immediate intrinsic moral consequences that we're discussing here. But I don't know. There's a lot to dig into that I'm just thinking about now. But the theme of fatherhood is really the theme of responsibility, because there's nobody who has more responsibility than a father. Everybody has responsibility. And Kieslowski gives us all these wonderful, really well-drawn female characters throughout the series, but there is nobody who has more responsibility than the father.